I want to welcome you very warmly to La Trobe University's Ideas and Society programme. Today, our second speaker is John Hirst, whom many of you will know, who was until recently reader at La Trobe University and widely regarded as one of Australia's preeminent political historians. His books include Convict Society and Its Enemies, The Strange Birth of Colonial Democracy, The Sentimental Nation, and Sense and Nonsense in Australian History. John.
Well, I begin by agreeing with Henry. You'll see some disagreements as we go along, and in our discussion at the end, we can have more explicit exchange, I hope, about those. So definitely, Australia at its foundation in 1901 was a racist nation. Its policy was to exclude non-white immigrants, and its sense of identity was tied closely to whiteness. White Australia was the national slogan, which was seen as the way to make the nation healthy, pure and progressive. The White Australia policy was abandoned in the 1960s, and from the 1970s, Australia widened its large-scale migration program to include all peoples of the world, without distinction of race. If there are still people who argue that Australia is a racist nation, they will have to concede that it is less racist than it was. I think it's wise to regard racism not as a fixed entity. In societies and in individuals, its strength and form vary according to time and circumstance. A person may not be a racist in Melbourne, but transferred to a country town where there are Aborigines living in a degraded way, they may well become racist. Let's continue with comparisons. Australia is obviously a less racist nation than Malaysia. In the 1970s, just as Australians were moving to accept Chinese as migrants, Malaysia moved to remove the Chinese from the prominence they had in business and in the professions, which they did so by discriminating in favour of the Malays. The Chinese accepted this legal discrimination as preferable to having their persons and property attacked in communal riots, to which the Chinese are also liable in Indonesia and East Timor. Malaysian racism was to the advantage of Australia because some of the Chinese came here to get a university education and a secure place in the professions. In Australian medicine, as you all know, the Chinese and then the Vietnamese are very prominent. Australia is a less racist nation than Fiji, where the native Fijians stage military coups if it looks like the Indians are going to gain some power. It is less racist than Germany, where Turkish migrants after 3 generations cannot gain German citizenship, which depends on German ancestry. The Social Democrats were planning to change this. I'm not sure that they succeeded. It is less racist than Italy, where all gypsies are to be fingerprinted. In fact, in Australia, all forms of racial discrimination are outlawed and closely policed. But we live with the legacies of white Australia. It is remembered against us in Asia, which we have to bear even when our Asian critics are in no position to throw stones. The racism of white Australia made the exclusion and oppression of the Aborigines much worse. As owners of the land, the Aborigines had to be cast aside to make European settlement possible. But the very existence of Aborigines, however small their numbers, was a threat to the purity of the white race, which became the national ideal late in the 19th century. So Aborigines lost their civil rights and their lives were closely controlled. These oppressions and humiliations were suffered by those Aborigines, mostly of mixed blood, who lived in the settled parts of the country. Whatever inducements are now held out to them to join Australian society, some of them are not interested in doing so. Their sense of identity as Aborigines lies in their not being like us, and who can blame them? When sympathetic outsiders see Aborigines still living on the margins, they conclude that white racism must still be operating. The problem is, rather, that generosity, goodwill, government spending of the last 30 years cannot quickly overcome the effects of past racism. With Aborigines in the outback, still on their own land and following some traditional ways, the situation is complex in a different way. Many of these societies are dysfunctional as a result of the anti-racism policies of the last 30 years. Equal wages made Aboriginal labour less attractive in the outback. Aborigines received the dole on a permanent basis without having to look for work. While having little or nothing to do, they regained the right to drink. Fortunately, there are now Aboriginal leaders who acknowledge how destructive these policies have been. But traditional life and practices themselves stand in the way of Aborigines enjoying the same standard of health as the rest of the population. If Aborigines attribute illness and misfortune to the sorcery of their neighbours, they will not take the precautions that we do. Recently, there was a report highlighting the extent of blindness and eye disease in the Aborigines. The common first response is to claim that governments should be doing more. But Peter Sutton, now an honest anthropologist, pointed out that the chief problem is not lack of government programs, but the failure of Aborigines to keep their faces clean and to follow prescribed medication. Western standards of health require Western ways of health maintenance. This is a truth that needs to be acknowledged by those who think that white racism alone explains Aboriginal disadvantage. I have been assuming that white Australia is long gone. You've already heard from Henry, and I'm sure you'll hear from Ghassan, that they think it is not gone. They and many other commentators see a revival of white Australia sentiment in the Howard government's policies to protect the nation's border and the widespread support for them. The asylum seekers arriving by boat were non-whites, Iraqis and Afghanis, but the government which stopped them coming was at the same time bringing into the country black African refugees at public expense and making the usual provisions to settle them into Australian society. The notion that the Australian government and people have turned xenophobic or racist is absurd, given the maintenance and continuing public support for a massive immigration and refugee program operating on a non-racial basis. Border protection is that, the protection of the border so that migration can continue as a scheme controlled by the government. Having stopped the unauthorised arrivals, the Howard government actually increased the rate of authorised migration. It almost doubled. This is something the critics of the Howard government have difficulty in recognising, let alone explaining. The migration program, started just after the Second World War, has been a great success. Migrants and their families have generally done well and by no means constitute an underclass, the role predicted for them by left-wing critics of the scheme. Integration of migrants has proceeded apace, with few lasting residential enclaves and a high degree of intermarriage. Of course, there has been some communal tension and racist hostility. It would be silly to assume that there would be none. One way to avoid tension and hostility is to keep the nation homogeneous, and not have a migration program. Most countries do not have a migration program. Australia has set itself a very severe test of its tolerance by running a program which has resulted in its having the highest proportion of its people born outside the country of all nations on earth except Israel. Recently, 3 experts on Australian immigration, Andrew Marcus, James Jupp and Peter MacDonald, produced a book which includes a rating of Australian level of tolerance compared with other peoples. Australians rate very high. That is, they are a very tolerant people. There is only a small proportion of the people who are actively intolerant towards migrants. There is also only a small proportion at the other end of the spectrum, those who are positively tolerant and want the government to support the maintenance of migrant cultures. The authors appear to regard the smallness of this last category with regret. To me, it is another indication of social health. The key test of our social health as an immigrant nation is the nature of the response when nasty incidents of racial hostility occur, which fortunately happens only rarely. Take the Cronulla riot. The police, to their great credit, protected the Lebanese, which is what we would expect, but does not always happen. Small as this event was in the league of communal rioting, there was widespread dismay that such an event should occur. Immediately, there were efforts to bring the Lebanese and the Skip lifesavers together. Soon we were presented with the image of a Lebanese Muslim girl kitted out as a lifesaver, including headscarf. The great challenge is not to explain the persistence of racism in Australia, which is weak and controllable, but how a formerly racist nation has run such a successful migration program. Here in brief is my attempt to explain this miracle. You will notice that it does not depend on finding any extraordinary virtue in the Australian people. The great program begun after the war was a government initiative, which for the first time included Europeans and not simply Britons. The non-British were meant to constitute only 10% of the intake, but the first migrants under the scheme were displaced persons from the war, Europeans, not Britishers. The scheme was heavily promoted as necessary to build up Australia's population, which was then only 7 million. So the migrants did not simply arrive or be reluctantly accepted as an obligation. The program was part of nation building, necessary to defend Australia against the Asian hordes. So the appeal to Australians was to their self-interest, a more reliable support than benevolence. The trade unions, suspicious of any migrants as a threat to jobs, were promised that migrants would work at award wages, which in a highly controlled economy was easily achieved. Contrary to expectation, the post-war economy boomed, so there could be no scare about migrants taking local jobs. Migrants, fresh off the boat, speaking little or no English, were at work at Holden's next day at full award wages, and though they probably did not know it, they had also joined the union. The official protection of migrant earnings meant that they were rapidly able to afford to buy a house and so join the Australian mainstream, moving out within one generation from the initial enclaves into suburbia at large. The early success of the scheme emboldened governments to widen the countries from which migrants were drawn. After all of Europe came Turkey, and then the big jump in the 1960s to Asia. By this time, the notion of differences in race had been totally discredited, and Australia was being damaged in its neighbourhood by the maintenance of the White Australia policy. So Australians were again told by their government that they had to accept Asians. The success of the migration scheme depended in part on there being multiple sources of migration. Australia would probably be a less cohesive society if all the migrants had come from one country. With such a mixture of peoples, there was no question that only English would be the official language. The downside of multiple sources is that Australia imported old world enmities of greater intensity than the Australian people feel towards any other race or people. I recall a Greek student here telling me that when his mother saw on TV dead children being pulled from earthquake ruins in Turkey, she cheered. Australians, having been told authoritatively that migrants were necessary, accommodated them by applying their usual relaxed style of social intercourse. The test for membership of this community are not goals difficult to achieve, like blood, breeding, wealth, or education, but simply whether you fit in, are friendly, and don't make a fuss. Not all migrants were happy with this chummy egalitarianism, but it was not hostility. Racism is a strong force in human affairs. Within the circumstances I have outlined, some designed, some not, Australians were brought to set aside racism and create a harmonious, multiracial society. The puzzle is why some people, in the face of this success, think Australians have a particular problem with racism. Thank you.
Than Professor Henry Reynolds.
Thank you very much for that welcome. I will begin by referring to a man called W.K. Hancock, Keith Hancock, who was probably the most eminent historian that Australia produced in the first half of the 20th century and was very significant between, say, 1930 and the 1960s. As a young man, he produced a book simply called Australia, 1930, which is still one of the very best general books about Australia. But I refer to him in particular because he had this to say about white Australia. The policy of white Australia, Hancock said, is the indispensable condition of every other Australian policy. The indispensable condition of every other Australian policy. Now, I think that was a correct assessment of the importance of white Australia, particularly when he was writing 1930, and particularly for his generation who lived during the first half of the 20th century. That is, white Australia and all its associated ideas was central to Australian life between, say, the late 19th century and the 1960s, for more than 1/3 of the time of white Australia. In other words, white Australia policy is like a vast mountain range stretching across the centre of Australian history and overshadowing almost everything else. Now, Hancock also said about white Australia, the intention and significance are exceedingly easy to understand. And this was certainly true if you go back to read the reasons for the introduction of those two important bits of legislation, the Immigration Restriction Act and the Pacific Islanders Labourers Act. They were long debates during which almost everyone in the then very new federal parliament expressed their views. But perhaps the most interesting from our point of view is Alfred Deakin, later to become Prime Minister, of course. Supporting white Australia, or the Immigration Restriction Act, he said, "The unity of Australia means nothing if it does not imply a united race. Nothing. Federation was nothing if it didn't imply a united race." We here find ourselves touching the profoundest instinct of individual or nation, the instinct of self-preservation. For it is nothing less than the national manhood, the national character and the national future that are at stake. Profound instincts, the individual, the nation, manhood, character and the future, All of these were dependent on passing those pieces of legislation. Now, there were many other speakers who were much more overtly racist in the quite literal sense of the word than Alfred Deakin, and they talked about purity of blood, they talked about hybrids, they talked about mongrels, they talked about piebald races. But it's not just that White Australia was about immigration. It also reflected an attitude to the world itself. Australia was still a colony. It had no standing internationally. It could have no foreign policy. It had no diplomats. But it adopted immigration policies which implicitly were indeed foreign policy. Let me just refer you to the views of the Defence Minister of 1907, a man called Ewing, who had this to say. Every sane man knows if this country is to remain the home of the white man, it must be held, not by the power of Australia alone, but by the might of the white man in all parts of the world. In years to come, it will take the white man all he knows to hold New Zealand and Australia. Therefore, we must not break the link which binds us to our fellow countrymen in other parts of the world. We must seek to knit together the white man of this and other lands in preparation for that last deadly conflict which will assuredly come upon Australia. Surely an extraordinary statement. It assumes racial conflict is inevitable, the deadly conflict that is certain to come. It talks about white men in other countries on the other side of the world as being fellow countrymen. In other words, race had come to dominate not just attitudes to immigrants, but attitudes to the outside world. And white Australia, as Hancock realised 30 years later, in 1930, had become not just an orthodoxy, more truly it had become an obsession. It was indeed the indispensable condition of every other Australian policy. So it's my argument that white Australia sunk extremely deep roots in Australian soil. It was persistent and enduring. And as late as the 1940s, when the whole world was changing, it was so different to the world in 1900, there were people who still strongly upheld the essential nature of white Australia. Let me just refer to the Attorney General in the then Labor government of the 1940s. He said, "We inherited the white Australia policy from our fathers and grandfathers. It is our responsibility to see that it is handed down to the great-grandchildren of our great-grandchildren." It was going to be there forever. And that was, as I say, not just the view of an important member of the federal government, but undoubtedly the view of many, but by no means all Australians. And yet change was approaching Australia that was going to force it to also change. Two things in particular were significant. One was the rapid decolonisation of the world, so that by 1961 non-Europeans for the first time had a majority in the General Assembly. And the other was the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union in particular attacked the Western countries, America and Australia, for their racial policies. Now, it's my view that change in the 1950s was forced on Australia from outside. There were reform movements, they were important, they were passionate in their advocacy, but above all, change was forced on a reluctant Australia, just as it was later forced on South Africa in a much more dramatic way. So Australia slunk quietly away from white Australia, but wanted to do it without causing too much problem domestically. Well, then the question is also the persistence of white Australia. My argument is that given the legacy, the historical legacy of white Australia, it is inevitable that certainly some people, maybe many people, still hold views that were consonant with those of the people of the early 19th century. They may be minority views, but they're minority views of a particular kind. Let me suggest some differences here. There are minority views which we might say are perpetual, that is, they will also always remain minority views as far as we can tell. There are minority views which might be called prospective, that is, the views of the minority may become those of the majority. But what we're talking about are minority views which are retrospective, that is, views which once were popular and important and powerfully supported. It is not surprising that many people continue to relate back to those ideas. Indeed, someone accused of racism could simply say, well, I'm simply adopting the views of Alfred Deakin. Well, let's consider then the question of persistence. I suppose the argument would be that Australia has retreated slowly from the racism of the first half of the 20th century, partly brought about by outside pressure. But there are important ways, I think, where it is hard to see that there has been a retreat. Let's take Aboriginal policy to start with. It would be quite untrue to suppose that there isn't still a great deal of racism directed towards Aboriginal people, and equally by Aboriginal people directed at whites. Anyone who knows anything about North Australia will be aware of the perpetuation of those sort of powerful racial passions. But also in terms of policy, the whole reconciliation movement, seems to me, has become more and more assimilationist. And let me just take 4 examples. There has been a complete retreat from legal pluralism of the very minor kind that Australia had adopted from the 1930s, with the complete rejection of any consideration of traditional law. The outstation movement of the 1970s and 80s is now under threat, where people are being encouraged to leave their homelands, their small camps on the homelands, and go into larger centres. There is a turn against the use of Aboriginal languages in education, and of course there is the intervention. Now the intervention, of course, is quite a complex thing. There are many aspects of it. I'll just touch on a couple. One is that it treats communities as collectives, that it is collective policy, collective treatment. And above all, it is highly paternalistic. It treats Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people as though they are children. And it says, in effect, we can treat you as children whenever we please. It is dealing with the problems of powerless by making people feel even more so. They are policies which even Joh Bjelke-Petersen would have blanched at. And then there's the very, very current question of the boat people, the strange obsession we have. And it seems to me the best way to consider this is to compare it with what happened in the late 1970s at the end of the Vietnamese War, when there were large numbers of Vietnamese boat people. Now, you may remember that it was the Fraser government that agreed to accept them. Australia behaved impeccably. There was, of course, criticism, but in the end we ended up taking in 100,000 Vietnamese migrants. Now compare that to the present. It is quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary. And yet it would be quite easy. After all, the Tamils, many of them are English-speaking, as we know. They have been fellow members of the Empire Commonwealth, and there is a large community here that could receive them. But our behaviour is totally extraordinary. And then finally, there's the question of street crime against people of non-European background. And I refer to the comments of a young African in Tasmania recently at a community meeting of the Cabinet. He had this to say: "I am of an African background. We are still being defiled in the streets for the colour of our skins. Racism is still there. Discrimination is still there. I'm asking the government to educate the wider community. We would like to see Australians accepting all of us. Now, it's my argument that indeed racism is still there, but given the heritage that Australia has from the early 20th century, it would be most surprising if it wasn't still there. How could it be otherwise? Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce our third speaker, who is Professor Ghassan Hage, and he is a future generation professor of anthropology and social theory at the University of Melbourne, and one of our most prominent theorists about racism and multiculturalism in Australia, and active in the Cronulla events as well. Not as a participant, but as a, well, actually as a participant. Among his books that I know many students read and discuss, as well as those of us who are older, are White Nation, Against Paranoid Nationalism, and most recently, Waiting. Ghassan.
Let me begin by saying that I'm not a great believer in a consortium of white or mildly white or mid-white people sitting together and deciding for themselves whether they are racist or not, whether white Australia is racist or not. I think there is a certain amount of self-indulgence in which has been actually part of a wide international cultural current, which was manifested in Durban at the United Nations Conference on racism, where the great nations that brought you scientific racism, colonial slavery, colonial racism, colonial extermination, decided that it's up to them to work out who is and who isn't racist. And that third world looking people and third world cultures have got it wrong. Basically what they said, leave it to the superior race to determine who is racist and who is not. I'm not saying we're doing this here, but I think there's a whiff of it. I think there is a certain sense of, we can, white Australians, academics who are part of white culture, etc., can somehow decide without speaking to those who are subjected to racism and interrogating their subjectivity, whether really we are not racist. It's a long continuum of the amazing things that white people and white culture comes up with. For a superior culture, for a superior race, white people have certainly produced a lot of idiots and a lot of idiocies, if you ask me. And you have to, when people sort of like engage in this, remind them, why isn't there a bit of humility given your history when you are asking such questions? And I think this is what I would like to talk about. It's about the culture of racism in Australia. It's not really about how many Australians are racist and how many are not. It's a different question to ask, are Australians racist? I don't think Australians are more or less racist than anybody else. I don't think the people who are racist all the time. I don't think white Australians have a monopoly over racism. I think sort of like Lebanese, Greek, Vietnamese are quite capable of doing a lot of racism themselves. So racism as a behavior is not a white disease of some sort or another. That's a different question. My question is there a culture of racism in Australia? And what are we doing about it? Let me put it to you this way. Australia has constituted itself physically through a racist act as a territory. It is the product of an act of appropriation of a land and the decimation of a people who were defined racially. We are the inheritors and the beneficiaries of this foundational act of racist theft. And so, to my mind, if we want to ask to what extent Australia today still has a racist culture, we start with a self-indulgence. That is, it's not about whether we have or not. We do. How much are we doing to deal with it? How much are we doing to minimize the fact that we are a racist culture? Anyone who starts from a position of let's debate whether Australia is racist or not, to my mind, is already racist. Australia is racist. And remember, I'm not saying Australians are racist. I'm saying Australia has a racist culture. And so the starting point is, what do we do with it? Are we doing enough? When I say we are the inheritors of an act of theft, I think I'm just saying the obvious. I'm not trying to be sort of like controversial. I think it's an obvious fact. We are the inheritors of an act of theft. And the value of Australia's wealth today is not equal to the value of what was stolen. Sure. I think people who have come after the act of theft have built Australia's wealth, whether they are from England or from Lebanon or from Greece, all have increased Australia's economic wealth. But that does not change the fact that there is a proportion of the wealth of Australia, the economic wealth of Australia, which is, I will define, a black economy. It's a black economy in two ways. It is black economy in the sense that the source of this wealth is indigenous. It is a black economy in the sense that it is an economy of theft. We are all complicit in the circulation of stolen goods, and we are part of a black economy. Now, to my mind, when I see the intervention, the issue is not really whether the intervention is racist through what it is doing or what it is not. Sure, we have these debates, they're important. Are people doing the right thing? It's a question, when I say I'm talking about the culture of racism, I'm interested in how it is done. Is it done with a sense that we are returning some stolen goods? Is it done with a sense of humility? Is it done with a sense that we owe you, and what we're giving you is not even 1/100th of what we owe you? Or is it done with a sense of we're so great because we're trying to deal with our indigenous problem? I think if it's done with humility, if it's done with a sense that no matter how much money we put in the indigenous sector, it's nowhere near what we should be putting, nowhere near, not 1/100th, simply in terms of economic value. And then we will be on the road towards dealing with this issue, what into my mind sort of like we'll start looking at attempting to deal with this primary racism. Any self-congratulatory stuff is simply a reproduction of this racism. Likewise, this original primary act has shattered indigenous psyches and has shattered indigenous society. That's what racism does, it shatters. In what way are we trying to help indigenous people recollect themselves such that the effect of this shattering is not reproduced? That is an issue. Australia not only has constituted itself territorially through this primary racist act, Australia has constituted itself symbolically through another racist act. It has defined itself through the White Australia policy. It has defined itself, and its imaginary has come into being against indigenous people through the repression of the indigenous presence as part of one's identity, and through a delineation of not wanting to be part of a third world looking environment. This is a racial mode of imagining the identity. Has this changed? It's not enough to say we used to think that we don't want third world looking people. Now we're very happy to have third world looking people. This can still mean we, white Australians, are happy to have third world looking people in Australia. It does not change the nature of our imaginary of ourselves. That is, when we think of ourselves, we Australian, and start having images that are not white, then we are talking about changes of identity. As long as we are still thinking, we Australians, and you think you're white, and you say, we're fantastic, we're having all these kind of like non-white people, and look at us, we haven't challenged the racist foundation of Australian identity. So, likewise then, there is a sense of the spirit in which things are done. Today, there's a debate about the asylum seekers. I'm not very qualified, really, despite the fact that 99% of the Australian population appears to be qualified in deciding sort of like what is happening with asylum seekers and what is the right policy. But I know for a fact that you can reject people in a racist way, and you can accept them in a racist way. And you can reject people in a non-racist way, and you can accept them in a non-racist way. I don't think rejecting or accepting asylum seekers is what determines whether we're doing it from a position of a culture of racism. When we say there is a culture of racism in this country, it means back to the basics. It means, do we think of others instrumentally? Whether we think of them as good or bad. If you think of them only instrumentally, you're still steeped in racist culture. Do you think of them as a life force? A life force that's very important in racism, in existential racism. That is, when another person or another being is next to me, do I feel that their life is important for my life? Does their life propel me? Or do I look at their life and I feel that it is diminishing my life simply by mere presence? That is core existential racism. And this seeps into all kinds of policies, all kinds of very nice policies, as well as nasty policies. It is, to my mind, when we want to start to deal with racism as culture, this is where the game starts. And we're nowhere near dealing with this issue. Thank you.